Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the Comics Connection podcast, where we talk about the realities of the business and creative side of being a professional comic book creator. I'm still Gamal. He is still Andy. And the comic book industry is still dying, depending on who you ask. The what we're actually going to be talking about today is an article that came out from it's an op-ed that came out from ICV2 last week about the concerns that one particular comic book prominent comic book shop owner has about what he referred to as the comic book industry. We will also talk about a kind of rebuttal piece that came out a couple of days later in Comics Beat. Now, before we start talking about this, Andy, did you actually read both of these pieces?
I did. I did. That's what happens when the news comes out like a week ago, and I've got like 7 or 8 days to read it. Then I read
Mhm.
them. Yeah. No, I did read these. I read both of them, and there's been a lot of talk in the industry about them. So probably because we're a little late to this particular party, probably that means we get the last word on it. So there you go.
Probably. And with I think having a few days out to actually digest it and talk about it gives you a little bit more time to, instead of giving a knee-jerk reaction, to kind of give a more like thoughtful and nuanced response because you've been able to chew on it and because you've heard both sides. Last night we
Yeah,
had a
I did have a little bit of a like knee-jerk reaction or whatever. Yeah, you're right. Like it helped, I think, to actually sit on it. I read this like the day it went live, and and I've continued to give it like refine some of my thoughts on it. It would take a long time to dissect it all point by point, but anyway, we'll get into it. Sorry,
Okay. I mean, last
I'm
night
jumping
we
ahead.
we talked about it in the Comics Connection Q&A for our members, but you weren't part of that Q&A. So why don't you give everyone the kind of high level reaction you have, especially since you are a publisher who actually has books in the direct market. So your perspective is going to be a little bit different from mine. Mine is going to be a much more high level kind of business perspective. But since you actually have books on shelves, what was your reaction or is your reaction now?
Uh, well, just to high level recap it, basically what Phil said was that the direct market is dying, and then he gave a list of reasons that he think led to it, but it all kind of boiled down to he felt that publishers, specifically Marvel and DC, which are the two biggest in the direct sort of superhero market, um, I don't know, he just kind of like wrung all the cash out of the consumers that they could and burned away all the goodwill, which I doubt is actually true. Um probably in either case, the cash or the goodwill. But
Mm-hmm.
um but there is some truth to the market being down, the direct market being down, and that is painful for a lot of people. It's painful for retailers, it's painful for creators, it's painful for publishers, distributors too. Like, I mean, they get paid per unit that goes through their warehouses and onto their trucks and everything. So it's just down, which just means there's just less money for everyone in that chain. And when that happens, those people that are running a very slim profit, and it drops a few or more percentage points, they start running into the red, and then it's a question of how long are they capable slash willing to operate in the red. um, and that goes for, again, all of them: retailers, publishers, distributors. And so, yeah, that's where it all comes from. But yeah, Phil threw some stones. He cast some stones around.
Mm-hmm.
um and But ultimately, my take on it from a publisher, and this is just given what I've been doing the last several months since the market has dipped significantly. I mean, it is down, and it's not just, I'm talking with a lot of other publishers, big, medium, and small, and we're all feeling it. We might be feeling it in like different places or in different ways, but it's definitely hitting everybody. Um, and my reaction is, okay, if there's, if I'm making less money doing the thing I'm doing, then probably I need to not be doing as much of that thing. So it just means adjusting your business model and like where you're going to chase. So if the direct market for me was the bulk of my income and now it's not, then I'm going to lean into something that is working, whether that's crowdfunding or it's bookstore sales or it's whatever.
Hmm.
Um, so it also means that we're looking at changing some formats, changing some price points, changing, kind of the audience that we're going after. What we're not doing is kind of yelling out into the world that everybody should want our stuff just because they have always wanted our stuff. Like that's what
I
I'm not doing.
I think that is the ultimate. Well, if you look back when you, and this is not to cast dispersions or make generalities about comic book shop owners or the direct market in general, but the direct market was historically a response to the collector's market in comics, which was a very narrow segment of the overall market when comic book shops started to pop up in the late 70s, early 80s. Because there was a pipeline, most people did not go to comic book shops to get comics. They went to the newsstand, grocery stores, pharmacies, whatever. When newsstands started to wither away, not for any fault of anybody in the comic book industry, everyone shifted to the comic book shop. But the idea that the health or the profitability of the comic book shop or the direct market is equal to the health and the profitability of the comic book industry is not accurate. I mean, I understand that publishers, if they have a lot of if their distribution model is primarily the direct market is contracting significantly, then all of those people and anybody in that chain is going to be hurting significantly. But that's not the comic book industry. The comic book industry is encompasses direct market and Webtoon, which is growing, and Kickstarter, which is growing, and young adult sales through things like Scholastic and Viz. When we talk about the big two, we talk, and this is a general term that was put onto Marvel and DC. But if you look at it in terms of sales over the past few years, it's Viz and Scholastic that are actually the big two. Marvel and DC have about 10 to 12% of that market, respectively. So the wider comic book industry, especially if you look at all of the ancillary things, even if you're looking at Marvel and DC, who have theoretically wrung all the cash out of the consumers, well, the consumers spent a couple $1 billion on the video games and the movies and all the other stuff. So it's not the IP, it's a particular format in a particular distribution channel, which may have a lot of systemic factors in addition to a lot of the things that Phil Boyle brought up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense to me. I mean, and it could very well be that we have been watching the same thing happen to comic shops that happened to newsstands.
Mm-hmm.
When the comic shops opened up and they created this new business model where the way the newsstand works is the publishers ship to the newsstand whatever the newsstand doesn't sell, they just ship back. It's all returnable,
Right.
right? Actually, what they would do is rip the cover off, and they'd get a
Mm-hmm.
credit for any they didn't sell, and then they were kind of on the honor system to throw them out. So which is why if you look at older comics, it says if you bought this without the cover, blah blah blah, illegal, so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. So what the direct market did was it was owners said, you give me a good discount on these comics, I'll buy them outright. Like no returning them, no getting a credit for them. If I can't sell them, I'm stuck with them.
Mm-hmm.
And the publishers were like, man, we're going to stop throwing away 80% of the stuff that we print. This will be great. It worked out really well for everybody. What it did was it did exactly what you said, which was move the people that were like really interested in comics, that sort of collector market, or somebody who wanted to make sure they got every single issue because they didn't want to miss one.
Mm-hmm.
They all started to migrate over to those specialty shops where and this happened with me. Like, I mean, this was all happening when I was a kid, basically. And I went to 7-Eleven for comics for years.
Hmm.
7-Eleven that at 6 years old I was allowed to walk to. Comic book shop opened up in my small West Virginia town in the middle of the mountains of nowhere. Comic shop opened up. Um, and is actually still there today. I talked with the owner not that long ago, new owner, but anyway. So so when I would miss something at the newsstand, it'd sell out, or they threw it out early because nobody was really paying attention or whatever. I could go there and then usually find it. And so then I just started going there. Like, well, I didn't need the newsstand, so I
Hmm.
we just like migrated. So, and it could be that we're seeing that now with manga and webtoons. It's like there's not the need for the store because there's really great content that's available in other places and maybe even be more easily available in other places.
Hmm.
And so it could be that we're just seeing that as well. Excuse me, the direct market may still survive and thrive on superheroes because it may just be like that's where you go if you're a superhero comic
Hmm.
fan. And then there's other stuff there too. But in the I mean, the idea, sort of the underlying idea of what Phil was writing was we should go back to, I don't know what he's thinking, but it sounds like 30 years ago to me, 30 to 50 years ago, right? Like it's like we should go back to the way comics were done then, and then that'll fix everything because if we turn the clock back on comic books, then somehow that will turn back time on the rest of the planet in
Hmm.
all ways. And that's it's an unrealistic premise. I mean, we're all sci-fi fans, but I'm pretty sure that's not how time travel works. So my
When
feeling is
you
if you turn
said
the
that, when you talked about turning back the clock, I instantly thought about the end of this first Superman movie, and Superman flying backwards and turning
that
around.
is, yeah, well, that is how time travel works. So
Well,
so
w-
I don't know. It just seems to me like if I mean, and I think it was David Gabriel, the vice president of sales at Marvel, who's been there 25 years now or whatever, like kind of famously said at one point when confronted by retailers, was like, stop doing all these variant covers. He was like, we will stop doing them when you stop buying them,
bingo.
right?
You cannot complain about the behavior that you support. If you continue to support the behavior will continue. And I think when you're, and the other point that you brought up, which actually dovetails to this quite well, is that these companies are, they're not in the same, they're really not in the same business overall. Like Disney and Discovery is not in the business of selling comics. Disney and Discovery is in the business of leveraging IP. And in that whole leveraging situation, comic book shops are a very minor piece of that puzzle, to the point where it's the idea of not, the idea of taking demands or suggestions or anything else from the comic book shops isn't really relevant because it doesn't change anything significantly for a company of that size. So to this,
Well,
the
Gamal, let me ask you this. Hold on. Let me ask you this. How much do you think the DC being bought by Warner Brothers and AOL and whoever else has bought them in the last 5 minutes,
Mhm.
and Marvel being bought by Disney, how much do you think that has changed their relationship to the comic book stores and direct market? Has it changed it drastically, just in ways that aren't like super specific, like because the concerns are bigger and they're all out here, and like
Mhm.
Disney's just like, all we care about is that we own Captain America and I can make one Captain America movie and that makes more than all of publishing. So what do I care about publishing? Like, you think that's where that attitude, like, is that the attitude that some very high up people at Disney probably have? Or do you think, hey, this is the market that supported us. It's an IP engine. This is where we get all this new content from.
Mhm.
I don't know. I have some of my opinions, having worked on staff at some of these places in during some of these transitions, and there's a lot of mixed signals, right? It's not going to be
Mhm.
all people feel one way.
Yeah.
So it's but I'm just like, do you think that them being bought by those two giant corporations has really drastically affected their relationship to the direct market in a primarily
I
negative.
I I believe so. Now I have no insider information. I have no. This is. I'm just looking at systemic revenue stream. Because when we're in Comics Connection, when we talk about conglomerate comics, we're talking about companies that have so many different streams of revenue based on this comic book IP that the sales of comics, especially when you look at the profit margin of comics, is so low relative to the amount they get per video game sold or the amount they get per movie made that comic books, especially single issue, like periodical comics, are primarily, from my perspective, research and development and marketing. Now, the difference between what Marvel can do in this form of research and development is instead of paying someone to research and say, well, make me a trailer for a movie or make me a pilot episode of a TV show and see if it works with a focus group, I can literally take that idea, put it into a system, and people will respond in real time with their dollars. So if I give Hawkeye a new costume and the sales bump up, well, when we go to design the mobile game, we'll give Hawkeye the new costume. That's it. Because there's so much money coming from not just movies and video games and everything else, like the apparel revenue coming from the licensing of Marvel is so much more than the comics that I don't believe that Discovery or Disney can even focus enough attention on the direct market for it to make any difference to them. These companies are not selling comics. The comic book shops are selling comics, and if the comics don't sell, the comic shops are hurting. But Marvel, if one comic sells 10,000 instead of 50,000 or instead of 100,000, it doesn't move the needle enough for them to actually make any changes at all. But and I'm talking high level. I'm not talking about what the editor of Squirrel Girl is thinking because they want to push up the sales so they can keep Squirrel Girl so they can keep their job. I'm talking about what Bob Iger is thinking about. What Bob Iger is thinking about is different from what Stan Lee was thinking about. Stan Lee needed to sell comics. So Bob Iger doesn't need to sell comics.
Yeah, I think that's all of this is sort of creating this situation that we're in right now, because actually it's interesting to me because some of Phil's suggestions I think have actually become part of the problem causing the situation that we're in now. A little granular here, but like one of his big things was these characters are, I forget what term he used, but like for all intents and purposes, he says they're icons, right? And they really
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't change and all that sort of stuff. But then you think about what made them icons. What are the stories that we talk about, not just like this month, but like what are the stories that we talk about 10 or 15 years after
Mm-hmm.
they've come out? Right. If you look at a character like Spider-Man, arguably the most popular superhero, Batman might have him beat. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a handful of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't take a ton, but like if you look at the ones that we talk about, they're the ones where something substantive changed, even if it reverted back eventually. But like, there's of course the origin story, Amazing Fantasy 15,
Mm-hmm.
that established everything. So that doesn't like break anything because it built the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the next big one after that is when Gwen Stacy died, which
Mm-hmm.
was a really big deal. It was shocking. It was the first Marvel comic without the comics code on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like it broke all kinds of eggs and barriers, and it was a major status quo shift. And there are others, but like other big one was the black costume and the creation of Venom and all of these Craven's Last Hunt where he gets torn down. There's like the wedding issue. Like all of these things are major changes to these characters. Do they eventually kind of get smoothed out and undone and like go like the ripples from the pebble in the river? Yeah, but you need to be trying for that.
Mm-hmm.
And the sense I get from the article is like, don't do any of that. And that's what I feel like they're doing right now. Like, it seems to me that Marvel and DC are in this cycle of regurgitating the same fairly blasé content and I'm not saying that to disparage anyone working on them, creators, editors, or whomever. It's a challenging environment right now when you are held by these corporate entities, because one of the things that happens is we got a new Batman movie coming out. Don't break Batman.
Hmm.
Right. And it is a change in attitude. And usually you can do like a project off to the side that's like not Batman, but it's
Hmm.
like Batman over here. We don't talk about this Batman, which means we can do something cool in it.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that that's actually been part of the problem for the superhero comics, is sort of the the lack of pushing the envelope. And again, there are books that do from those publishers. We're talking in very large generalities here. And then his other point was like they're doing too much of that, and he listed off these ways that he feel like they're doing, but all of the ways that he mentioned, I don't think happen nearly as regularly as he seems to think they do. Things like gender swapping or costume changes or whatever. Um, it really seems to me like those tend to be derivative things. Those tend to be flash in the pans. Every once in a while, you got a female version of a character that takes off. She-Hulk is a great example. She-Hulk's been
Hmm.
around forever, and she's awesome. But she's also very different from the Hulk, which is kind of what makes her work. She became her own character, the attorney thing, and all that stuff is very different from Hulk. So all of that said, it just seems to me like there were so many underlying assumptions in that article that I'm not sure were accurate,
Hmm.
that it kind of just made the whole thing fall apart for me. And as a publisher, and I think as a retailer, the choice is fairly simple on a high level. And it's, if you don't like what's happening right now, like if your books aren't selling or our books aren't selling or whatever, then you need to adjust. You can't
Hmm.
make the world change, but you can adjust to the world. So that's it. That's it. And if you are at a point where, let's say as a publisher, I don't want to publish anything different. Like let's say I publish in a really simple niche and the audience
Hmm.
just isn't there, isn't coming out for it. I can adjust to this niche over here that's selling, right? I can go make zombie comics all day long. And I think
Hmm.
I could be really good at that and sell those. I'm not particularly interested in making only zombie comics.
Hmm.
So if it's a binary choice, if those are my only two options, then I go make zombie comics and my business continues, right? Or I decide I don't really want to make zombie comics and I get out of the business.
Hmm.
But I don't just bang my head against the wall and yell at everybody else.
Exactly. The underlying thrust of the article was the industry is not working, and therefore, instead of me figuring out what I need to do to change, like bring in a new audience and stop buying the things that I'm telling people not to make, I'm going to make demands of a group of people over which I have no leverage. The when we talk in Comics Connection about contracts and negotiation and everything else, one of the big things we talk about is leverage. If you don't have the power to make the other side do something, it is a waste of your time and effort to then complain that they are not doing the thing. You can't make them do that. So if you know that you want to keep your comic shop open, and if you know that the demographic you have served for 20 years does not respond to the books that you are bringing in, and you don't like the books that you are bring in other books. It's not as if other books do not exist. There are independent books that may actually cater more to what you think a comic book should be. There is manga, there is YA books, there are all different types of books. And if you did that, that's the only leverage that you really have against a company, a publisher like Marvel or DC, because if they see that you're just going to buy other comics, then maybe they'll pay attention to what it is that you're saying. But I still come back to the idea that, and you mentioned it earlier, that these characters, once you get a character to a certain level, the character becomes a, he does not become a story vehicle anymore. He becomes a trademark. And that trademark has a certain value. So if you have, let's say you have Superman, You can change Superman however you want in the comics on a month to month basis. I think Peter David called it the illusion of change. But at the end of that
Right.
cycle, whether it's the trade or it's the story arc or whatever, he needs to be Superman again because we need to sell hats and t-shirts and socks and everything else. We can't have a whole lot of other things going on. So if you're if your comic book and comics, I think, especially superhero comics, suffer from this more than other types of narrative art, you do not have the ability to push barriers as much because if you were doing a play and the lead character dies at the end of the play, that's fine because you're not selling t-shirts 20 years later of the character. He can be dead. It's okay. Comics is not like that. You got to bring the character back because we got to sell the merch. And sorry, bring the character back. That's it.
I have so many things I'd like to say, but we've been talking too long.
Yeah.
Not too long because it can never be long enough talking with you, Gamal. But I did want to point out, I I agree with everything you said, but I also want to point out that we mentioned the article by Brandon Schatz and Donica LeBlanc.
Mhm.
They are the ones that run Variant Edition in Edmonton, Alberta. And I said it would take forever to go point by point on Phil's argument, but that's
Yeah.
basically what they do in this
Hmm.
article, and they do a really good job. And so I recommend that article is on the beat on
Yeah.
comicsbeat.com. And it's really well done. And I feel like we've kind of said like, ah, what Phil said is terrible. And it's not like, I 100% I get where he's coming from, right? Like,
Hmm.
I'm an old man that yells at clouds also. But
Hmm.
um but also, there are certain realities that, like, we just sometimes you just don't like reality. And, like, I feel like that's something that, like, kind of in our culture, like, we're struggling with right now, is like,
Hmm.
I don't like reality, therefore I'm going to make up my own.
Exactly.
And it doesn't work like that,
No.
unfortunately, for most of us. But yeah, and ultimately, the last thing I'd like to say is, um Brandon and Donica's article really has a vibe overall of optimism about the
Hmm.
market. Um, and I think I'm there with them. I'm not 100% convinced that, like, I'm gonna be like, I've worked on stuff that's been very popular and sold through the roof and all that kind of stuff, and that's great and it's fun and it's really exciting and cool. But I'm working on stuff that's more personal to me now, stuff that I really believe in creatively and all of that kind of stuff, and it is selling. But if the market really turns and says, whether it is zombie comics, just to use my other example or whatever, and it's something that I don't feel that I'm cut out to really do well, or something I'm not particularly interested in, I do have the option of stopping, right? Like, I can do something else,
Hmm.
or just not keep doing that anymore. And I feel like often, and I don't know if this is part of sort of like American culture, but like, for a lot of people, that would be like admitting failure, and which is like the worst possible thing that can happen to someone. But I don't, maybe it's just I'm older, but I don't see it that way. Now I just see it as like, I could just go do something else and that would be
Hmm.
okay. Like, I'd want to make sure, I want to take care of employees, and I want to take care of the people as much as possible if I were at some point to say we're going to stop doing this. But but beyond that, it's okay to not do a thing that I've been doing for a while. Like, that's all right.
Yeah. If you actually have a business based on a particular set of industry assumptions and you get into the industry and the industry has changed or changes while you're doing it, you can adjust your model or you can not be in that business. Those are options that are available to you. The option, and I think we've said this 3 times, which is why we're going to wrap up now. The option that is probably not the best thing that's available to you is to attempt to change the industry reality when you do not have the power to change the industry reality. You can only change what you can do. You can't change what is everything else that's going on around you. So we're going to wrap up right here. Both of the articles that we have been talking about in this particular discussion are going to be in the show notes so you can check them out. There'll also be a link to check out Comics Connection if you want to be part of the larger discussion that we had, and we continue to have both in our live sessions and in our Discord. So until the next time, thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have fun with your comics.